She's an award-winning, internationally recognized happiness researcher, speaker, educator, and author.
For those of you listening, I just want to start with a quick disclaimer. I have an adorable 2-year-old French bulldog who is sleeping on the floor behind me. And so all of my degrees are in health science from Western University. I'm from London, Ontario. That's the piece of happiness that my work focuses on.
I mean, my mantra has always been in my career is strategy, structure, people.
And before the pandemic, when I went into an organization, I felt like I almost had to go in like a lawyer.
Good day, everybody. Thank you all for tuning in or watching this week's episode. Today, we have a bona fide superstar, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a background here. So I'm going to read it because there's so many things to list about Dr. Gillian I've had the fortunate pleasure of knowing for the last couple of years. So here we go. Here's some highlights. So welcome, Gillian.
Thank you. I am really, really happy to be here chatting with you today. It's going to be fun. It's always a fun time chatting with you.
Always, yeah. So, for those who don't know, she's an award-winning, internationally recognized happiness researcher, speaker, educator, and author. She also has a PhD from Western University in health science, and we'll get her to touch on her journey around that. And her primary area of research around happiness and health. Now, here's the kicker. She's named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by Women's Executive Network, and I told you that she's a bona fide superstar. Her work also combines latest research, wisdom. She's all over the place on TV. We'll talk about that. She also knows that there's no secret to happiness, but there is really a science to it. She's passionate about the research, about it all. And I think really she'll touch on this. It's really something that, 10 years ago, you probably wouldn't understand what it was, but it's something that we all definitely struggle with. And we'll talk about how the pandemic kind of uplifted that a little bit. I have a question for you on that. The other thing is she is the founder of the International Institute of Health Research. She is a research associate at the World Database of Happiness based out of Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, a place I'd definitely love to visit. And she's also the co-lead investigator of the Canadian Happiness of Health Work Study. I know you work with Staples, all sorts of organizations. We could probably be here for an hour listing all your accomplishments. But she's also a prominent media personality. You'll find her on TV. She's been on The Social, Marilyn Dennis, The Breakfast Television, The Morning Show, Global, ABC News, and we can go on and on. So welcome. Yeah, you know what? Before I'd like you to get into your background a little bit, then we'll get into some top 10 questions. I think for me, yes, having known you in some of these groups, but I think I think everybody loves is your belief system. And I know for me, that's something that was like, oh, yeah, I totally agree with that, or I see where she's going. So for those of you who don't know, for your benefit, I'll tap her belief. There is no secret to happiness, but there's a science to it. And let it be known, we can speak about this for days on end, but we're going to keep this as short and sweet today. Happiness is not a destination, that's a practice. I think for me, when I listened to Sean Acker about 2 or 3 years ago, the art of science of happiness I thought it was a thing, like, oh, and I do this and then that, but that's really not the case. And we'll touch on that. Happiness is not something that we earn. It's something that we learn. I think in one of your keynotes, you talk about it being like a muscle, right? It is something that we have to do. The pursuit of happiness doesn't mean you need to be the goal all the time. And your last belief, which I like, when we know better, we can do better. And the right information and taking action are really all about the essential ingredients to a happy life. And it's about empowerment along that journey. So welcome. If you could be so gracious to give us a little bit of background, touch on how those beliefs came to be, and then I'll get into some questions and we'll keep the conversation going.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to our chat all day long because it's always fun, like I said, to talk to you. For those of you listening, I just want to start with a quick disclaimer. I have an adorable 2-year-old French bulldog who is sleeping on the floor behind me. And he is a snorer. So at any time, if during the audio you think you're hearing snoring in the background, don't worry. Like, I'm not putting myself to sleep. It's just my adorable little guy who brings me lots of happiness. And there's lots of research on pets and happiness, which we can get into later maybe. But so yeah, I'm a happiness researcher. And oftentimes when I tell people that, the number one question I get asked is like, what is that? Or like, is that a real job? And it's a fair question because what's really interesting is that up until about the mid 90s, there wasn't a lot of peer reviewed academic work really focusing on happiness,
Mhm.
which now when you sort of stop and think about it, it's pretty shocking that up until fairly recently, as researchers, we were focused on what's wrong and how do we fix it, disease management, disease treatment, as opposed to sort of the other side, which is health promotion or, turning up the volume on life, doing the things that we can live our best life ever. And so all of my degrees are in health science from Western University. I'm from London, Ontario. Go Mustangs. And my research interest has always been like, how do we live our best, healthiest life ever? And so for my PhD work, I started reading all this research about the connection between happiness and health. And what we see when we look to the research is that when we compare happy people to less happy people have lower rates of cardiovascular disease. They have stronger immune systems. They heal faster from injury. They tend to make better nutritional choices, sleep better, both in terms of duration and quality. They have better outcomes and in the workplace, productivity, evaluations by their supervisors or customers, dollars. In their personal life too, they're more creative, they're better problem solvers, they have longer and more fulfilling marriages and friendships. So when I started reading this data, I thought this sounds like a pretty fun thing to study because one, happiness is universal, right? We all want to be happy. There's no stigma associated with saying, hey, I want to be happier. And now the research is starting to catch up and we're really starting to learn some of those things. So my background before I studied happiness was actually childhood obesity. So I was focused on physical activity, sedentary behaviors, nutrition. And so that's what I went into my PhD studying. And halfway through, I started studying happiness. Recruitment was much easier studying for happiness than obesity. And since then I have been teaching and sharing and talking all about the science of happiness, because I think it's really important to know that no matter, for you listening right now, no matter how happy or unhappy you're feeling right now, the data is very clear that each and every one of us have the capacity to not only just increase our happiness short term, we can actually learn habits and skills to sustain it at higher levels. Because every once in a while I'll have like an Eeyore type person, I call them, put up their hand and they'll just say, Gillian, I'm not a happy person. And there's sort of three main players when we look at the sort of our total capacity for happiness. One is our genetics. So we can thank our parents or not, but that does play a role. The second one is our environment. And I think all of us, having lived through a global pandemic, understand better than we ever have how our environment can affect how we feel. And then the third piece is the piece that's up to us. So that's our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors. And so that's the piece of happiness that my work focuses on, because we can't change our genes, right? Maybe gene expression a little bit, but hard. We could all just up and move to Costa Rica, but probably not going to happen. But when we think about our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors, we live in our head all day long. And for the most part, we control what we do. And so that's what I do. And that's where I focus in terms of the sort of the happiness piece.
Awesome. Thanks. I love that you mentioned genetics. In one of our previous podcasts, we talked a little bit about AI, but also the explosion around genetics and understanding your DNA and where you are. Because whether you're blessed with good genetics or not genetics around that piece, there are tips and tricks that you could do to either amplify the strong ones and subdue the wrong ones. And I think that's the piece where science and technology today is accelerating, and people like yourself leading the field around happiness. I mean, my mantra has always been in my career is strategy, structure, people. You got to get your business strategy right. You got to get your structure, how you organize, what you do, where you're going. And then it comes down to people. Now, strategy must always come first in terms of your thinking, but people must always come first in terms of your behavior. And I think, one of the essences, my belief is too many businesses fail. Too many people are unhappy for reasons that they don't need to be, or they don't know how to deal with it, or nobody really talks about it, right? And I think that's why I appreciate the work that you're doing in this type of podcast, is to socialize to people. Okay, what can you do during these different circumstances? And what is it? Is it a state? I have been guilty of saying, I will be happy then when I get this car. And you sort of get, which was actually true. I purchased a car and I thought, even though knowing this, I'm like, it wasn't what I thought it was, right? And so
but it was still a pretty fun car to go for a car ride with you in.
Right, yeah, for sure. Like, it's still fun, right? And so it's then it's all done, and then you're like, okay, now I'll move on to the next one, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So So let's hop into a couple of quick questions, especially when you talk a little bit about the environment. So the first question, one of your topics that you always talk about is the science and happiness. And like I said, we could spend days on this, let alone a little bit of time here. But can you elaborate on the key factors that influence happiness, especially when you think about what happened during the global pandemic that we just had? Like, how do we adapt our understanding of happiness to a new reality? Like, what does it, a lot of people aren't as social as they used to be, or people are coming out of their shells, those sorts of things. What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, this is really interesting because I have researched happiness before, during, and now after the pandemic. So because I always have, my curiosity lens on, I've, noticed some changes. And one of the big things I will say is that before the pandemic, I do, like you mentioned, I do a lot of media, and I also do a lot of public speaking and sort of conferences, workshops, corporate engagements. And before the pandemic, when I went into an organization, I felt like I almost had to go in like a lawyer. And I would almost have to convince people about why it was important that we were having a conversation about happiness, particularly in the workplace, or with professional organizations at their annual conference or something like that. And so I would sort of like put on my lawyer hat and say, I actually have a PhD in health science, and here's all this research about the connection between happiness and health. Some of the stuff I talked about earlier, right? Workplace outcomes, personal life. And then I would get into, okay, well, what do we actually do about it? Then the pandemic hits. And one of the biggest changes that I have noticed is that our conversation about happiness has really evolved from why do I care about happiness to what can I do about it? I really feel that one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been that it has brought the conversation about mental health, about how we are feeling, to the forefront like it has never been before. And there used to be a lot more stigma associated with saying, like, I'm just not having a good day today. Or, people felt like they needed to say, yes, hi, how are you? I'm fine. I'm fine. And now that conversation has deepened beyond just fine. And people are understanding that it's way more draining to try to fake or pretend to be happy when we're not having a good day. And so I do think that that's one of the benefits or the silver linings that has come out of the pandemic, because the conversation has really evolved. If you look even in the workplaces, how many people are now, workplaces are putting more supports in for mental health for their staff. They're bringing people like me in to have these conversations. They are providing, more counseling sessions. They're providing more workplace services, employee benefits. And so that is one thing that I think has been, because the conversation about how we're not robots that wake up in the morning, do our job, go home, and then live our life, right? The other thing about the pandemic is it's blurred the lines for a lot of us between work and our personal life. And especially if we're sitting at home at our kitchen table, the lines get really blurry, but we're human.
Absolutely.
And the data is coming out is really clear that when we are feeling better, we are better at work. We are better for those things. And we're starting to understand that it's not this siloed approach, right? Like you go to work, you do your job, you come home, and then you're dad. And then you go, it's all of that. We are all that all the time. And we're not just these robots going through life. And I think that that's been something that has been a positive that we have seen from a very, very difficult, devastating time.
But sure, I think you hit on a note that I think even my own corporate workplace where I lead, we talk about, like, we've added employee assistance program that we've always had pretty good benefits, but we added the EAP so people can call, and because it was a weird time, and it continues to be a weird time. And I think the piece that really resonated with what you said to me is that I'm now encouraging any other I talk to hundreds of business leaders all the time. It's okay to say, hey, I'm a little bit off today, or something's happened. Like when you look about the work that, I think her name is Kim something, she wrote the book Radical Candor. And we always talk about like ruinous empathy, right? So people walk around with all these little fake sort of personas, but meanwhile, there are real underlying things that are happening that causes them to express their behavior. So at the end of the day, we only see people, at least for me, the observation is we only see people at the tip of the iceberg, but the reality is that they're a wholesome person. And it's okay to talk about what's below the tip, to say, look, I just had a bad weekend, and I might be a little off today, so I'm a little short. Just forgive me, right? And it's okay to say that. And so myself as a leader, and I talk to other leaders, I try to encourage that authenticity, which I think is really important, to say, look at, I didn't sleep last night. So if I'm, like you just said, right, we might hear some noises, hey, it's the dog, right? But it's the same thing in principle as it relates to your mindset. It's, hey,
Yeah.
I'm a little off, and, I apologize in advance, right? And in a few different workplaces that I've seen and helped with, especially ours now, I think that honesty and openness has been a real unlock. But
Yeah. And, sort of along those same lines, one of the things that was also interesting for me to observe is that a lot of people think that because I study happiness, that I'm happy all the time. And I think that one, I would be very clear, I am not happy all the time. It's impossible to be happy all the time. But another sort of thing that's come, has been really salient for me recently is sort of this idea that people thought that because I studied happiness, I'm happy all the time. And I think this is a good part of the conversation to really talk about the fact that it's impossible to be happy all the time. And I think that now, since the pandemic, we're tapping into all these feelings, and we understand that we have good days and we have bad days, and we have hard days and we have wonderful days, and we have everything in between. And what's really interesting when we look to the research is what we see is that people that set their goal as to be happy all of the time, so it's like they put on their blinders and all they want to do is focus on their happiness and they want to be happy all the time, those people are less happy than other people.
great
And
stress, right?
right. And I was like, when I first read that research, I was like, am I reading this wrong? Like, how can this be? Because I thought about it and I thought, okay, if I set a goal, say, for example, I set a weight loss goal and I, am moving towards that goal, but I don't quite reach it, like, at least I'm trending in the right direction. Right. So I was like, why are they less happy? But then when you unpack it a little bit more, you start to think about it. It's like, what happens when we don't reach our goals? Right. Our self-talk comes in. It's very critical. We can be hard on ourselves. We, might be lacking in the self-compassion department. And so one of the really important things about happiness is understanding that we can't be happy all the time. And knowing that it gives us the grace to be a human and to have and to experience the full spectrum of human emotions. And to your point, the question about the pandemic, I really do think that conversation has expanded and we are able to sort of more frequently, more comfortably be able to express other emotions other than I'm happy, I'm fine, that's it,
Yeah, I think I love what you said, and I think it's just understanding, like, the human condition is a range of emotion. There are, of
Mhm.
course, if it's always sunny, right? Guess what? You won't appreciate that it's always sunny. But when it's rainy, there's a role, or that happiness is, or that state of sadness. Like when someone passes, I had a recent death in the family. Like, you need to go through those process of emotions and then focus on, okay, what makes me happy? What are the happy memories? I think, like you talked in the past, it is about that muscle and about focusing and enjoying the journey and doing everything you can to put yourself to do things that make you happy, but don't dismiss. I think I've been guilty in the past, and even Alec Promoji talks about it, where he said he was so focused on trying to be happy. It actually exactly what you just said. It creates the artificial sense of stress that you forget everything about you, and you forget about the beauty of stopping and smelling for the roses, like just going for a walk with the dog, right? With my dog, it's like go through the river, I just look at the river, see what's happening, just enjoy those moments. And yeah, that's great. So thanks for highlighting on that.
Yeah. And I think too, one of the important things to, sort of when I got into happiness research, I almost found like I had to unlearn a lot of things I didn't realize I thought about happiness. And what I mean is, like, we were never taught how to be happy in school, right? We were never taught. And then we look at the world that we live in and we have marketing and media and social media and advertising and movies and TV and sitcoms, and they're all sort of creating this narrative of what happiness is. And so no wonder we're a little bit confused, right? And so when I got into the research, I was often falling into, and you had mentioned this earlier, this idea of I will be happy when fill in the blank, right? And I mean, to be totally honest, I caught myself as a happiness researcher thinking, I will be happy when I finish writing a PhD about happiness. And so we all fall
Yeah.
into this trap, even those of us that are studying it. But one of the big ahas or light bulbs for me was understanding when I got into the research that happiness is not a destination. Like you said, right? We don't arrive at happiness and then we're set for life. The way I think about happiness is it's a practice or a habit. It's sort of like physical activity or nutrition, right? Like, say, for example, I actually did. I just went to the gym earlier today. I didn't leave the gym and text you on the way home and say, hey, I just had the best workout of my life. I've reached fitness, right? You never received
Right.
that text, nor would I ever send that. It actually sounds silly to say because we understand that, guess what? Tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to go back to the gym because we understand that it's something that we have to do if we want to live a happy, healthy life. It's the same as nutrition, right? Like if I made a green smoothie this morning and I put like all the superfoods in it, I would never drink my smoothie and think I've reached nutritional wellness, right? Lunchtime's going to roll around and then I'm going to be hungry again. Like we understand that if we want to be healthy, we have to move our body and we have to choose healthy food most of the time. And so a big piece of happiness is just really understanding what it is and that it's not a destination. It's part of it. A big part of it is a practice. It's a habit. It's something that we actually have to work at, just like nutrition and just like physical activity.
Yeah, I hope to your point that you said earlier, we don't really learn this. There's so many topics that are critical to life in general that aren't, there's a role for a traditional school system, but oftentimes in a lot of the core elements of, how to deal with certain things and what does it mean to be happiness, how to find your happiness, and even like fitness and whatnot, like that is really, it's very subject specific. So you learn that when you're in like, say grade 6, 7, 8, but by the time you're 17, 18, it's very subject specific. And you're just left to go into a world, and you hit on earlier, where all the messages are, the world is now all about attention, right? And how do they get your attention? Like the human brain works in a fight or flight, right? And people are more motivated to not go to a game, but go, avoid a loss, right? And so a lot of messaging is there. It takes a lot of training and mindset to really get yourself thinking about that happiness is a journey and not to get distracted by all the, like I actually don't listen to any news, very little. I see the weather and that's about it. Because it is about brain food and not having those distractions. So actually speaking about that, I'll move on to the second question. One of your topics is about creating a happy mindset. And I think that's something that I kind of stumbled on and really accelerated when I sort of found into your work. But what are some, how do you cultivate a mindset in the face of stress and frustration and difficulty? Do you have any techniques for developing resilient responses or sort of a self-awareness? Like, how did you catch yourself in that moment? It's very easy to just go along and not catch yourself like you did. But when I finished my PhD, like, do you have any tips or tricks or thoughts around that?
Absolutely. We could spend a couple days on this one too. There's so much, right? Yeah. Some of the, I think the big, most salient things that have been helpful for me personally that I read in the research are, for example, so because we were not taught, like I said, to be happy, it actually requires us putting in time and effort and energy and focus if we want to do things that make us happy. Like one of my biggest pet peeves is when I open up like Instagram or Facebook and it's like, just choose happy today. And I'm like, it's not like something like you get up in the morning and I pick my shirt and I pick happy. Like it doesn't work like that. A lot of it comes down to, like I said, our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors. So if we think about our thoughts, that's a great place to start because we live in our head every single day and we do have some control over what we have in our environment around us that we put in our head, right? We get to choose. There's some things in life we can't choose, right? But there are some things we can. We get to choose what podcasts we listen to. We get to choose, if we're commuting to work, what am I listening to? We get to choose what am I watching on TV, like you mentioned, the news. I mean, this is coming from someone who works on TV, and I'm saying that, we really do need to be very mindful about the news that we're consuming. You'd mentioned Sean Aker before. Him and his wife, Michelle Gillian, did a study and they found that just watching 3 minutes of news that you perceive to be negative in the morning, you have a 27% greater likelihood of reporting your day as unhappy 6 to 8 hours later. So I think sometimes we often think like turn on the TV or just have it on in the background, but it is important. It actually is quite meaningful. And the residue of it, if you watch the news every single morning during the week, at least one of those days, your day is going to be less happy 6 to 8 hours later because you just tuned in. And so part of this idea of thinking about a happier mindset is understanding that we need to take back some of our control over our thoughts, right? We all are often familiar with, like the anxiety spirals, right? Or, you have one thought and then it spirals and then all of a sudden like the world is ending or you're dying or something, right? We have those. Yeah. With happiness, we actually can see what are called upward spirals of positive emotion. And so what that means is that instead of focusing on the big things, like oftentimes we think it's, the trip that we're going to go on, we think it's the promotion that we're going to get, it's the car that brings us the most amount of happiness. But when we actually sit down and look at the research and data, it's really about creating small bursts of happiness, small bursts of joy, small positive bursts throughout your day. Because those little bursts, those little things, like you said, taking some time to go walk with your dog, or going to the gym, or having a phone call with a friend, while those things are not really large in terms of time commitment or sometimes even effort, the impact is not small because for two reasons. One, it creates, like I said, that upward spiral. It's like, say, for example, like I'm going to get off this podcast and I always enjoy talking to you, and this is filling my cup. So when I get on my email after, I'm in a better mood than if I wasn't, right? So we start to get a little bit more pep in our step. We feel a little bit better. And the thing about the small things, and I'm using small in air quotes if you're listening, because I don't mean small in terms of impact. I'm talking about small in terms of time and effort. We think that one walk with our dog, or that one phone call, or that, 15 minutes we took to watch a funny YouTube video didn't really make a big difference. But if you actually start to add those up, we live most of our days day to day. It's pretty similar routine sort of thing. It's not the week that we have off on vacation. That actually adds up to a lot more time than that week on vacation or things like that, like those big shiny moments. And so part of the idea of understanding, I really want to create these small bursts, is a really empowering thought too, because now I have taken my happiness, and instead of it being contingent on something that may or may not happen in the future, I have brought it into today and asked myself, what is something I can do today? And while we all can't have bright, sunny, shiny days all the time, we can't be like that all the time. We each can do one more thing today to make us a little bit happier. And then over time, we start to build that habit. It's just like any habit, right? Like, I mean, did you have to work really hard to brush your teeth this morning?
No,
right?
Right? Yeah.
So over time, these things happen. One of the really cool things about our brain is we think that we're like these smart, rational, logical creatures. And yet, especially when we look into some of the psychology research, what we see is that we're not. And one of the examples of that, when we look at sort of in terms of how we think about happiness, is our brains have, it's almost like pre-installed software that came in our brain called the negativity bias. And what this is this is our brain's natural tendency to focus on the bad. And it really came from a good place because, if we hit rewind and go back in time, we had to watch out for like lions and tigers and bears, right?
Survival mechanism.
Exactly. And so what's happened now is that our brain has not caught up with the modern world. So it's like we're running old software in a new computer. It's not working. And so what the negativity bias is like, say, for example, today, 10 people give you 10 compliments, right? And one person says one bad thing. At the end of the night, when you go to put your head on the pillow, like, what are you thinking of, right? That one bad thing.
That one.
And so when we start to understand that, the way we sort of override or sort of reinstall new software is we actually have to actively train our brain to look for the good, right? And it takes a lot of effort at the beginning. We actually have to work at it. Some people do it by focusing on things that they're grateful for. Other people, like a lot of times people say, okay, Gillian, like what's your number one tip to like boost happiness? And a lot of times what I say is that we're all busy. Before we start adding on things like gratitude, which can be a very great and effective practice for a lot of people, before we start adding to our list, step number one is starting to take inventory for the good things that we already have in our life and notice them and appreciate them. One of the other silver linings I will say from the pandemic has been that when I ask people before the pandemic, what makes you happy? A lot of times I would get answers like my new car, the trip I just went on, things like that. When I ask that question now, a lot more frequently, I'm hearing things like going for a walk with my mom, going to a movie theater, going to the gym, having dinner with a friend, right? So a lot of things that we actually engaged in pre-pandemic, when those were taken away from us or restricted, we understood how much those had a positive impact. So step number one, especially when we want to start thinking about how do we override this negativity bias, is it's not about seeking, like SEEK, seeking more. It's about starting to see what we already have and appreciate now in our life that is good. And I think that that's a great place to start to retrain our brain, to start to get that mindset in of overriding that negativity bias and really starting to really hone in and notice the things that we have that are
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this before, but I think you said it, but I'm going to attribute you to it. But the idea that really resonated with me is that energy goes where thoughts, where like your energy goes where your thoughts go. And so to your point, if you take an inventory of actually things are actually pretty good, right? Like you know, I am loved, I have family, my dog, this, like, or whatever people that I have this, I have that, and you start inventorying your thing, right? Like I have great family and friends and this whole 9 yards. You start to realize, yeah, you're right. Like you have more than what you need. And I sometimes find, and talking to others in the trap of like this external validation where, no, we have a lot more than we think we do.
Yeah.
And I know for me, one of the tips I do is knowing that my energy goes where my thoughts go. One of two things: I'll either listen to music, right? So I love music, and I'll put something on that really shifts my mood. Or two, to your point, myself, I'll go for a walk or go for another walk with Dexter here, and then I'll listen to a podcast, right? Because I want to feed myself with positive or to where I'm going with business and or life or whatever. And I think that's one of the things I do to really align well with what you've been preaching.
Yeah, I love that. And both of those, like, there's a lot of research in terms of how music can affect our mood, right?
Yeah.
And so that can be, because like sometimes a lot of happiness is like a habit that you build over time, like practicing gratitude. But like sometimes it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you're on your email and you're getting snarky and you need to shift your mood instantly. And one of the most effective instant mood boosters is moving our body, right? And it's like you said, it doesn't need to be for a long time. It could be putting on a song and just like changing our thoughts. It could be putting on a song and having a little dance party. It could be going for a 5-minute walk around the block. But those little things really do work as like a pattern interrupt, because our thoughts, like I sometimes I walk to the gym. I live downtown Toronto, and my walk to the gym is about 15 minutes. And one day I was like worrying about something, and the whole walk to the gym, I was worrying about something that may or may not happen. And then I got to the gym and I thought about it. I'm like, I just spent 15 minutes worrying about something that may or may not happen. And I lost that 15 minutes. And so to your other point about putting on a podcast or something, when we're having those days, and we all have times when we worry and stress, right? And so sometimes it's not as simple as being like, just
Normal.
choose a new thought. But in those cases, putting on a podcast and getting lost in a conversation can be a great way to shift, to listen to something, to learn something, but to help rein in that monkey mind when we are having a hard time doing it on our own.
Yeah, it makes sense. When you talk about walking, you live, in a 3D world. My next question kind of comes around today's current environment is a lot hybrid, right? There's a lot of virtual meetings like this, or everything's, people, you don't need to go to the office 9 to 5 anymore. It's all mixed up. However, there's a real thing called Zoom fatigue, right? And so, how do we combat the effect of Zoom fatigue? And I think you just mentioned a couple of them. You go for a walk that also not just physiologically boost you, but your mindset, but also maintaining, like, how do you maintain meaningful connections in a world that has gotten way more digital than it ever was, while at the same time try not to burn out?
Yeah. Oh, this is a really big one. I was actually I do a lot of work with Staples. They have this council called the Work from Anywhere Council. And so we discuss a lot of issues around workplace, hybrid work. What are some solutions? We do data collection. I was actually just reviewing a survey. We're going to do some data collection with Angus Reid. But the reality is that we are now on our screens often a lot more, right? Whether it's, FaceTiming with our friends, Zooming, meetings, Teams, all of these things. And so one is starting to determine like what actually needs to be a video call versus what can be a phone call. Sometimes we just go to Zoom as the default, right? Where it's like, does this need to be on camera? Because a lot of us, like, I'm used to being on camera from being on TV, but I'm not used to staring at myself on my computer screen for an hour during a meeting. And so it's a weird thing. And the other thing about this is like, the reality is we can sit here and we can kind of complain about how the world has changed or what we don't like. Or we can focus on other pieces too, like, okay, well, this is great because now, like, you look at something like a Facebook, for example, and say you have a hobby that's not super popular, like you love to collect miniature toy planes. One of my cousins loves to
Mhm.
collect like these little mini toy planes. And now he's in a Facebook group where people from all around the world that have those same interests post their photos, they help each other, they give tips. So sometimes the connection or the ability to connect with people all around the world is a really positive thing too. So I think at the end of the day, the way I see it is, so when I was at Western, I taught at Western in the Faculty of Health Science for 4 years while I was there. And one of the courses that I taught was a course that I created called Health and Social Media. So it was a 4-year course in the Faculty of Health Science, and it was all focused on social media, media, and how that impacts our health, both as someone who a lot of my students were going on to be health communicators, right? They were going on to be doctors or nurses or physio or chiro. And then also, how do we consume it? And so day one of my class, first slide I put up was a picture with a quote from the wisdom of Spider-Man. And it said, with great power comes great responsibility. And this is
Yes.
how I see all of this. We have an opportunity to connect, to communicate, right? Like sometimes it's great. We can have a Zoom meeting and I don't have to commute into downtown Toronto and back every day. Like there's a lot of positives, but there's also it can go slippery slope where we're spending too much time on our screens. We're getting zoomed out. Is that a new tune?
Yeah.
Zoomed or burnt out.
Burnt out. Yeah. Yeah.
But so this is where it's up to us to really be intentional as best as we can to try to navigate things to, if we are feeling tired, maybe turning off our camera. But then also it's easy to go the other way where we just have our camera off all the time and we don't actually make an effort to connect, right? So just starting to become, making sure that technology is a servant to us, not a master,
Yeah, I love that. And wow, that really hit, because I think that makes a ton of sense. And it really made sense to me what you said around like the digital and having someone like your cousin with the toy planes and whatnot. Like you can leverage the technology not to zoom you out. So like one of the big things is if we're having a conversation and my hands are crossed like this and I'm on Zoom, that's a very negative reaction. So I think one of the things is have a Zoom where body language is important, right? You're trying to simulate energy and sort of warmth. Whereas to your point, sometimes you don't need to do that. And then you can seek out like 2D groups. I like what you said, because I do think the concept of happiness is a mankind thing. It's a humankind thing. It's not religious, it's not racial, it's not political. It's what everybody wants. And there are different things that make people happy throughout the world. So I love that example about, the toy plane, because you might think it's weird among your friends, for example, but really it's not. It's just an interest that you might have. And there are others like us that have those interests. Like myself, I have what's called like a mild sloping hearing loss, but I wanted to be a fighter pilot. So my goal was not to be a business guy. I wanted to be a fighter pilot and fly planes at Mach 2 and drop bombs. I was in the military cadets and whatnot. And when you said that, it almost made me think, I wonder if I should find a group of people that were in the Army, but that couldn't go on. Myself was in the Air Force, that couldn't go on for whatever reason, right? Because sometimes they said, well, you can be a mechanic. A mechanic's a great job. But I'm like, no, I don't want to service a plane or be a commercial airline pilot. Like, I want to go really fast. And hence, one of my dreams is to get my pilot license. But those are really great tips. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And just to touch on one thing you said about culture, a lot of the conversation that we're having today is a very North American conversation. Because what's interesting is that when we actually look globally, happiness is different in different cultures. So in North America, a lot of our happiness is about me, performance, achievement, right? I want this makes me happy. But say we hop across the pond and we go to China or Japan. A lot of their culture, instead of being an individualistic culture like we are in North America, it's more of a collectivist culture, which means sort of more community oriented. And so what we see is that while we often, across the board, everyone wants to be happy, what makes us happy and those sort of things can change. So like I said, say we're in Japan or China or somewhere, it's very much, community, we, us, together. And so what's interesting is that, across the world, different things make people happy.
Happy.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up because what I one of my goals is to visit Japan.
Yeah.
Beautiful people, beautiful culture. But I had some friends that just went over there and they were just talking about exactly what you said, that there's this social contract around what people do and how they behave and how things are organized in public. Like I haven't been there, but from what I heard, it's like super clean, super efficient. People respect each other, and if you look at their crime rates and probably their happiness, they're probably I'm going to venture, but it'd be interesting to see, what's actually true. But you're right, there are cultural nuances. Being of Italian descent, the whole social thing.
Hmm.
My second cousin's wedding, we talked about earlier, was just, all the cousins were all on the dance floor, shutting the place down. And for us, that's what we grew up. It's very, very social, always being together. And you're right, the North American culture is a bit different, but I think the need for happiness is universal, but how you get there is definitely different by culture. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's awesome. You kind of touched on it before in terms of like, oh, when I do this, I get that. But the question I have for you is, have you found anything else that was surprising or counterintuitive in your research about happiness? Like, I've always thought I'll be happy when, right? And then the reality is not that. Are there
Mhm.
any other things that you've uncovered along the way that might have been, oh, I didn't really think that was true? Um, I think you touched on, happiness and health. It kind of sounds obvious when you say it, but actually you don't think about it in the first place, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And some of the sort of the myths that we see that are quite pervasive are along those lines, like I will be happy when I get X amount of dollars, I get this promotion, that sort of thing. And then what we see from research is that one, say we get that thing, we get the guy, the girl, the car, the house, the job. Even if that happens, it doesn't bring us as much happiness as we would have anticipated that it does. And that happiness doesn't last for as long as we think that it does. So that's really interesting. And another one we think like
Mm,
a lot of times we think, I'm going to grow up and then I'm going to get married and then I'm going to live happily ever after. Right. And what we see is that marriage doesn't make someone happy. If you have a happy marriage, that makes you happy, but it's not like getting married is this golden ticket to happiness. Because a lot of times
sure.
what we see is that when we take our happiness and we put it contingent on anything external, whether that be money or material things or a person, now what we've done is we've taken something where we have some control over it, and now it's dependent on something else. And that is a very slippery slope into a dangerous place. And so I think
Mm,
that one of the things that I've really learned that's been particularly helpful for me personally, because I apply all of the things that I learned in my research and I try these things. But one of them was really starting to check in with myself and think, okay, like what's in my control and what is outside of my control. So, this is not a new
right.
idea. The Stoics were talking about this, many, many years ago.
True.
In research, we call this idea of, focusing on the things that we can control autonomy. And autonomy is more of a predictor of our happiness than how much money we have, how popular we are, how good looking we are, or how good our sex life is. And so this is something that's, I could just listed those and we're all like, yeah, okay, I get how those things impact our happiness. Well, autonomy is more of a contributor to our happiness. And so I think that a big piece that I didn't realize was really, and we sort of touched on mindset, and this kind of fits into that camp too, but it's really about asking ourselves, what are the things that I can control and what are the things that I can't control? And so when we start to put our happiness on when I
Mm,
get that car, when I get that job, when this person loves me, when whatever, when I have kids, when I get married, when I get divorced, now we've put it on to things that we can't necessarily control. And
so,
so really bringing it back to ourselves, focusing on the things that we can, trying to notice the things that are good, appreciating those. A lot of the happiness is just really understanding what it is because we were never taught, like I talked about too. But that was something that I think it was really surprising is we often have these myths that we tell ourselves in our head, and to know that they don't even bring us as much happiness as we think they do if we even get them in the first place. That was
right.
pretty surprising.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I think was it Marcus Aurelius that talked about that autonomy quote, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful because I think everybody, myself included, place a certain element of our happiness on external things, and I think that's probably the worst thing that we could do because we've given up that control. I think that's a fantastic nuance and piece to think about. Well, this has been an unbelievable conversation.
Hold
Where
on,
else can people?
I've got a
Oh, you
quote
got
for
some?
you. I got the
Yeah, yeah,
quote.
yeah.
The one.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Pull it up.
actually from Epictetus, from The Art of
Ah,
Living, the classical manual on virtue, happiness, and effectiveness. And he says, happiness and freedom begin with a clear understanding of one principle. Some things are within our control and some things are not. It is only after you have faced up to this fundamental rule and learned to distinguish between what you can and can't control that inner tranquility and outer effectiveness become possible. So, what a nice way to end with Epictetus,
wow,
right?
what a perfect. That's absolutely perfect. And can you highlight for the audience where they can find you or follow you?
Yeah, sure. So, my website is my name, which is Gillian Mandich. I'm Gillian with a G. So it's GILLIANMANDICH.com. And on Instagram, I'm at doctor, like DR, not the word doctor, and then my name, Gillian
Yeah.
Mandich. And I don't really go on Twitter very often. So I don't even know what my handle is there. But yeah, those are the best places to find me.
Those are two of your best places. Well,
I
thank you for your
basically just use
time.
Twitter to tweet to Jocko. So I named my French bulldog Jocko, and I like to keep Jocko Willink updated on what my guy is doing. So I use Twitter for that purpose only, basically.
For that purpose.
Yeah.
So fun. I don't follow that, so I'll have to follow that one. So
Yeah,
thanks.
Instagram's a great place to find me if you're feeling social. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time and have yourself a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you so much for having me. I love what you're doing and putting these conversations out into the world. So I'm so grateful to be your friend and also to have had this time to chat with you today.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.